As we move towards bringing children back to school, we must ask who was worst affected by the pandemic and why. Decoding Exclusion, an interview series by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, aims to discuss the various facets of the problem of exclusion in education in India. With a range of experts in the field of law, policy, and education, we examine evidence on new sites of exclusion and ways in which we can support children and their households as we bring them back to school. Welcome to Vidhi's Decoding Exclusion, an interview series where we break down the various facets of exclusion from mainstream education in India. I'm Nisha and I lead the Inclusive Education vertical at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, and in today's episode I'm in conversation with Madhuri Dhariwal. Madhuri is the Associate Director of Learning Platforms at Indus Action, a policy implementation organisation working in the sectors of education, nutrition, livelihoods, maternal and child health, among others. In today's conversation, we discuss how organizations like Indus Action try to address vulnerability through a focus on social security of households as a unit. We also discuss the challenges that the state faces in tracking and bringing back out-of-school children. I was especially excited to hear about some of the innovative practices that emerged during COVID-19, such as using Bluetooth to share educational content. Finally, we talk about the importance of partnerships with communities, with other NGOs, researchers and practitioners when working in the development sector, and what the role of researchers and organizations like ours should be in times of crises. There's a lot of insight from Indus Action's various efforts in the field, and I hope you enjoy it. So with that, let's jump into the episode. Hi, Madhuri. Thank you so much for joining us for this interview today. As you know, we are at Vidhi doing this interview series called Decoding Exclusion. And in today's conversation, we will be discussing supporting the support system, so to speak, right? So in some part, we'll be talking about the role of the household and the role of the state in addressing the larger challenge of out-of-school children in India. And specifically in the context of COVID-19. So firstly, I'll introduce Madhuri to our audience. Madhuri Dhariwal is the Associate Director of the CEO's office at Indus Action. She's been at Indus Action for, I think, about 4 years now, but has been in the education sector for far longer. So, without further ado, Madhuri, I think we'd like to hear a lot more from you. So just to start off the conversation, the first question we wanted to pose was during the COVID-19 pandemic, Indus Action did a lot of work in actually responding to the needs of households and children, during the sort of height of the pandemic. So can you tell us a little bit about what this work entailed and who were the different kinds of stakeholders that you were working with during this time?
Sure. Thanks, Nisha. Thanks for having me here, first of all, and congratulations on the report to Vidhi as well. So in this action, I'll also just give a very brief intro so that everyone knows what is the work that we do primarily. So we're a policy implementation organization working to bridge the gap between law and action. So what that translates to in real life is that there are policies, there are legislated rights that people have, there are schemes and policies created from that. But there is a gap in them actually reaching the last vulnerable citizen who they're intended for. So that is the work that we do of ensuring that that implementation happens well, that all of the stakeholders involved in that ecosystem, starting from the government to the community, other civil society organizations, are made aware of their rights, are made aware of the policy, the processes that entail the actual implementation, as well as then working on capacity building within that ecosystem. So plugging in tech where required, because tech is for us a means to an end and not an end in itself. So putting in technology where required, doing capacity building for understanding of the policy and the process, as well as the technology. And within the community as well, building in sustainability measures. So we try working with an objective of nobody becoming dependent on Indus Action, such that if we exit, then there is a vacuum in the ecosystem. So we try building in sustainability measures alongside our work in itself. So be it partnering with different people in the ecosystem or, working in the capacity building and awareness bits that I was talking about. Currently in about 12 states across the country, pre-pandemic were in 20. And major areas of work over these past almost 10 years now have been education, maternal and child health, nutrition, as well as livelihoods. And we're looking at a gamut of social security benefits and welfare rights right now.
Right.
Coming to your question, you mentioned like during the pandemic, the work that we were doing, when we realized that, the news of the lockdown and the pandemic hitting other parts of the world, like COVID-19 spreading across the world came about, we realized very quickly, I think, the first realization was that the work which we were doing before that, which was focusing on Section 12(1)(c) of the RTE Act, which I can touch upon a little later, which is more the education part of our portfolio, as well as the child and maternal nutrition and healthcare work, that would very quickly fall to the bottom of the priority order for anyone and everyone. And possibly rightly so, because at that point there was a bigger health risk out there. And we had to pivot very quickly to thinking, what are we going to do to support the families who we've been associated with, and at that point for 7 years. And the second bit that was very obvious, I think, was the entire migrant labor crisis that the country was looking at. Right. So our role has always been one of a very systemic player, where we've not had too many direct interventions on the ground, but we try working on systems change more so. So with that lens in mind, we were trying to understand how do we pivot really quickly to support the system in supporting these migrant laborers, as well as other vulnerable populations. So there, the first things we started doing was we looked into the database of families that we had who had connected to us through the two portfolios I mentioned, and we picked up a subset and we started just calling them. We created like a template of what are these major areas that we want to look at. So there's healthcare, there is access to welfare entitlements, there is also and specific welfare entitlements that were targeted towards COVID. So there was the PMGKY, which is the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana. And that was launched for like as a special package as well during COVID. Do people have awareness of that? Can they get access to it, etc.? And then looking at more immediate term things, do they have enough ration? Do they have access to immediate medicines that they need, etc.? And this work we started doing across the country with multiple states that we had data of. So that was, I think, the beginning of our work from April 2020 onwards. Our major focus area and the key findings that we had was that across different states, there was a different reaction, right? So unemployment rates were growing definitely across the board, which was sort of expected as well. But what that led to, like what that loss of income led to, was then loss in access to multiple other resources. Right. And so when we look at education from that perspective, or children and how they were impacted, they were one of the most neglected categories at the initial bits, because we were in a lockdown, nobody was going to school, healthcare was primary, etc. So that section got really neglected, I think, was one of the first things that stood out to us.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I think, across the board, because once COVID hit, our focus sort of remained in education and largely on like sort of evidence gathering. And I think our main finding, which is definitely consistent with everyone else who did anything at that point, was that education within the household had been deprioritized in a very big way, and really within, the larger sort of development sector in India as well, right? Because even funding, that became a huge problem, that funding itself sort of completely got sort of deviated to these other sectors that were definitely, and like you said, rightly so, more urgent at that point of time. So, as you said, you all sort of decided to change towards working towards like right-based awareness on specific entitlements that y'all felt were more urgent at that point of time. Is that something that Indus Action is continuing to do now? And I think you specifically mentioned, yes, the COVID-specific entitlements as well, but specific to children, what were the kinds of things that you all were looking at?
Entitlements that I was talking about, some focused on women, some focused on children, and so some were DBTs, so direct benefit transfers. Others were, things in kind. So, for instance, extra ration being given and free ration in some areas, migrant workers. So, a lot of these indirectly were impacting children. So, when we're looking at access to food or access to healthcare, that was where majorly where children were getting impacted. So, prenatal care, for instance, right? There is the food that goes through ICDS to pregnant and lactating mothers. That was a specific focus area for us as well, where we were trying to understand that, is that ration delivery happening on time? Are vaccinations and immunizations happening on time for these mothers and their newborn children? And, we realized very small things that came up, like something that an Anganwadi worker said, I can't carry 20 kilos of that panjiri and mungfali on my back and kind of walk door to door, and which is why I've not just delivered in this past month. And that was such a fixable problem, right? Like easily fixable. You get an auto and that goes in the in those narrow lanes with that worker, and that can get resolved. But insights like those were really useful. And those were kind of feedback loops so that we were trying to give back to governments where we are present in the states immediately, such that was, helping. There were multiple other instances where, majorly pregnant and lactating mothers, I think, became a focus for us because they were being, I won't say neglected, but they were sort of more vulnerable at that point, fending for themselves and the child. And so we also looked at access to vaccinations for these mothers. Whether that should be or not be was a huge debate.
At that time.
And so we were trying to work around that as well, generate awareness around it, but also get access to these mothers in hospitals, make sure that they can get vaccinated safely, go back, or set up camps where somebody can come in, or can it be done door to door, etc. Working with hospitals on doing that. So some of that work was around mothers and children. Apart from that, when we look at like the education sphere per se, I think the first few months there wasn't too much in that sense of entitlement, where education, because schools were shut. But there are a lot of efforts that were done by state governments in those.
Okay, so I'm definitely gonna come to exactly that question next. But just very quickly, so in your experience, because you all kept in touch with these households, for a large part of the pandemic, right? And I guess your response, or the COVID response, so to speak, sort of adapted to what you were finding on the field as well, right? So in that time, could you maybe tell us a little bit of, did you see a point in time when households started to slowly try to bring back attention onto the education of their children? Like at what stage did that sort of happen, right?
Most definitely. I think, Nisha, you and I both don't have kids, but speak to anybody who has a 4-year-old who's been at home for a whole year, and they're very quick to say that they wanted them back in school. So when you start talking to parents and households, I think this was a very huge concern that came up, because one, parents weren't used to staying with their children for that long, right? They're just in terms of logistics for the household, managing a child, managing food, managing and you're also working from home at the same time, mostly. Or if you are to go out, then you're coming back home with that health risk to the child during the pandemic. And so there was there were two camps to this, right? The whole reopening of school versus not was again a humongous debate. I think Twitter had a field day with it, but that was, there were people who were anxious to send their kids back to school. One part was this whole logistics thing of, what do we do with this child for like so long? But the more important bit, I think, was that these are very foundational years for children's development, right? And not only like the academic skills that they're learning, but also the socialization, the soft skills that they pick up in school, being with their peers, with their friends, around their teachers, like all of that was going missing. And so that phenomena of being a COVID baby was something that was very real, where children are not used to socializing anymore, not used to sharing what they have. The absolute increase in terms of devices, technology that they started using, TV, mobile phones, etc., because there was no other alternative for them at that point. So those factors were on this side of the camp, which really motivated parents to be like, okay, can we reopen schools? Can they be done? And so I think a lot of efforts were taken there to maybe have schools on alternate days, or have different slots for classrooms, etc. And then there was the other side, which was very scared for the health risk, and so there was that strong lobby of parents as well, who did not want schools to reopen at all, because they were, and because in children immunity is lower, etc. And so that fear of COVID spreading faster and which did happen in a couple of schools. I remember,
Yeah.
I think Andhra, it was the first instance where they had to then shut down schools again. If I say like timeline-wise, sorry, what you were asking earlier, but about 3-4 months into the pandemic was when they started resurfacing again. So April, May, June, I don't think anybody heard any of that. And also because summer holidays, so June and July, pretty much that. When the new session started and also the first wave kind of died down a little bit, our lockdowns became less strict, restrictions were lesser. I think people started wanting to get back to a more normal lifestyle, whatever that word means, but back to the way things were.
Okay. So, I mean, because one of the things that we sort of were, trying to understand through our own research as well is that, see, because COVID, yes, was, and I hope, a very, very exceptional thing that happened, right? And we're not expecting a COVID to ever happen again, and like touch wood and all. But but one thing that we do have to sort of consider is that, say, for example, with like the climate crisis, right? We do know that the incidence of something like, extreme weather conditions and things like that, especially in states that are already sort of vulnerable to it, that does already become like a thing that sort of hampers children being in physical schools, right? And then especially for households that are already vulnerable in terms of employment and this and that, in terms of investment, in a sense, we almost need to be preparing households for the possibility of increased crises, not hopefully at this scale, but in the extent in which it happens in their own state, right? So the obvious example that sort of jumps out to us is something like in Orissa, when you have extremely heavy rainfall. And when I was, say, working in like Anganwadis in Orissa, we would have like a curriculum that was designed for, an academic year, but actually because of rainfall, the number of times schools closed down, you were actually doing maybe 1 month less than what you had planned for, right? So given these kinds of things, as an organization that works so heavily on supporting the household, where do you think our focus needs to be for the most vulnerable households so that we can maybe offset some of the things that allow them to deprioritize, not allow them, force them to deprioritize education at the worst of times, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's very real, right? Like, I mean, the climate change crisis and also all of the natural disasters that a lot of our states see. So Odisha, you mentioned, but like all the coastal regions, cyclones, things like that, like that has been the case forever. So we were talking of something called climate proofing our policies and, so disaster proofing in a sense, if I can rephrase that. How do we do that for our overall work? So I think one example that I saw of this in like the education calendar particularly was taken up by, I will get back to you with the exact name of the school and this thing, but what they did was they changed the calendar year to be around the farming season and not according to the traditional calendar year. So they know that it's these 2-3 months that children are not going to be in school because they're helping their parents possibly in the farms, or at least the 9th to 12th grade students will possibly show up one day, not show up for 3 more days, and that will hamper their education. But and they might not need the winter break per se, because they don't traditionally have a winter break in their like life cycle of activities. And so can we just change the calendar of activities around education and have it be more suited to a particular state where you already know that there are, so maybe keeping something standardized, like it starts in July and ends in March, for instance, if that's what we want to do. But then the rest of the year, there is scope for some amount of change within that and freedom in terms of exam schedules, etc., all of those things. So that one example I found was really, useful in terms of supporting the families. But the other things that we look at, and that is something of the work that we're trying to do right now as well, is how else can we support the family in instances of any sort of a shock. So a shock like COVID, for instance, pushed about 240 million Indians back into poverty. And this is from a 2020 Oxfam report, right? If we have to sustainably keep them out, right, then what is the method? And so something that we're trying right now is to look, and we call it POWER, which is Portfolio of Welfare, Entitlements and Rights. But essentially the idea is to converge on a family as a whole and to see where are their biggest gaps for that particular family, right? also what are parallelly the entitlements that the state is already providing as a social security net. So since our work is very, welfare focused, we're trying to look at what are those access to certain schemes. So for instance, in education, there are scholarships available. There is, say, a cycle given, a bicycle given to girls to make sure they're able to travel, or within livelihood entitlements for children of laborers, so construction workers, registered labor, their children have access to separate scholarships through the labor department. So things like that, so that's education. Similarly, maternity spread across women and child development, health, all of these different departments, they have access to different types of maternal and child protection rights, as well as the schemes, entitlements that they have. So how can we look at a family targeted as a whole and get them access to a bare minimum, a basic amount of welfare that they get access to sustainably over a period of a few years? And that's a hypothesis we have right now, which we're testing out to see that, if they're supported for, say, 3 years in a row, does it help them move away from that cycle? Does it give them enough resources to know where to access support when required? Right. How can they do that by themselves eventually? But that's the idea. For at least a minimum period of 3 years, how do we support a family as a whole? And the idea of convergence, I think, is very crucial to all of this, because what ends up happening is when we talk of, say, education, health, labor, we're talking in silos. Right? It might be the same family, the same child that you need to target through all three of these. The same mother who you need to speak to and get the same Aadhaar card details 8 times over. But how can we not do that for them? How can we ensure that the state is collecting it only once?
Exactly.
And then depending on need, depending on where you see the family being placed, they're being provided those entitlements automatically. Right? So how can the state become more proactive in its approach to provide these welfare measures to the families, and the families also know how to ask for them? So like a demand supply side, both of it being balanced in a way. Along with that, I think some other aspects that we're focusing on, and particularly if I talk of children per se, that we're working on, one is sort of called RT plus in our current terminology. But what we're doing is looking at dropouts from the RT section 12(1)(c) groups. And we're trying to see why those children dropped out in the first place. But secondly, how can we prevent some of that? So providing access to these entitlements to the family is one way to ensure that there is economic stability in the household, which is not forcing the child to drop out. The second is then also we really thought that vocational education in the true sense of it does not always happen in our schools, really well. So if I can only see that there's either a science track or a commerce track, and I'm not a bright student enough, or I'm not interested in these, right? Sorry I said that, but like if I'm not interested in taking either science or commerce, a student like me, like I was not interested in the science or commerce. And when I took arts, it was like, are you serious? Like, why are you doing that to yourself? But is that third option there, right? Are we doing vocational education well enough that there are skills being taught to children in their higher education, so 9th to 12th grades essentially, that can help them choose a pathway to income, but also to livelihood, but also something that encourages them to stay in school and learn. So that is something that we're trying out right now as another measure. Apart from that, looking at like just the early grade children, 3 to 6 year olds. We're working on a school readiness program, because again, a realization that we had while doing our section 12(1)(c) work was that children from different backgrounds enter at very different levels into formal schooling, right? So
Absolutely.
Basic things of the number of vocabulary words that you know is very different. The kind of languages you can speak, things you can identify, exposure to multiple things. So how can we focus on that early grade learning, and how can parents and caregivers be part of that? Because the child in those formative years spends maximum amount of time with like family, parents, caregivers. So how can we ensure that there is some amount of learning built in such that we bridge the gap a little? We're still not saying that it's going to be the same level playing field, but how can we aim for that at least?
Absolutely.
That is another piece. Apart from that, I think Again, when we're talking of mothers and children, the maternity benefit schemes that we work on, there's a gamut of them. So Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana is one, PMMVY,
Yeah.
5,000 rupee DBT to the mother. But till the child is roughly about a year old is when they get the overall the money. So it is to focus on the mother's nutrition as well as the child's.
Right.
And that's another focusing on mothers and children. JSY again, so like multiple maternity benefit schemes.
Right. A really important thing that you're sort of talking about, right? And especially what you first described of like supporting the household in their social security, like access to social security for a sustained amount of time. And I think what you're describing is maybe moving towards what they would call like a social registry, right? As far as the administrative efficiency piece is sort of discussed. But I think that is incredibly important because we know from literature that when there is instability in the household and there is, there are shocks that happen, whether like a death of a family member or something much more sort of universal like COVID, it does sort of affect a family's ability to plan ahead, and that affects their like aspirations for the child as well, right? So creating that kind of sustainability, I think, can be extremely empowering in the long term as well, not just in terms of the day-to-day educational decisions. And then, yeah, that also sort of ties into what you were describing about the climate responsive kind of schedules, right? That's incredibly interesting, and I think even something very relevant to something like the migrant labor crisis, even outside of COVID, right? And we do know that migrant children and migrant households follow a certain kind of calendar over the course of a year, and can that be something that we actually look into when we're trying to address this problem? But so now, sort of coming to what you had mentioned earlier, that different states had already been, or started putting in a lot of effort towards education and recuperating once maybe the first wave sort of died down. Given that, again, Indus Action works across so many different states, I think you mentioned 12 currently. So during COVID as well, it might have been at least 12. So what was your sort of experience there? What were the kind of constraints that the states were facing, but also what were some of the measures they were able to take to kind of address this problem of out of school children and absenteeism and dropouts, during that time?
I think just to start off, I guess the first point that I'd want to just put across is that the constraints are very different when it comes to talking about like state governments, the scale at which they're operating.
Yeah.
The nature of challenges, I think, changes a lot when we're talking from like a direct impact. Can we ensure children in one school come to school versus looking at the entire state and saying, lakhs of children are out of school. What do we do about it?
Absolutely.
So just keeping that at the backdrop of whatever I will talk of now is really important, because in those, I think the first few months, the number of innovations that happened around education across the country were tremendous, right?
Yeah.
So, teachers, parents, administrators, educators at different levels, everybody was going through the same COVID crisis. So even as a teacher, if I'm at home, I still have my child as well to take care of, possibly, along with ensuring that there are 30 children who are trying to pay attention to me on that screen and everyone speaking at the same time, utilizing a technology I don't know how to use. For the first time, I'm hearing of these words called Zoom and Google Meet, and I have no idea how to deal with all of that. And I'm supposed to deliver content that is effective, that ensures children are also learning and, take care of their mental health, my mental health, all of it in the middle of that pandemic. So I think I, for one, am deeply appreciative of the work that education departments across the board have done in both government schools and then private schools as well, where, things have been taken up. So I'm, just upfront, like very appreciative of the efforts that have gone into at least trying to make sure that we're not just letting go and being like, sorry, we can't do anything. There's nothing that's possible. So, and if I talk of specific state initiatives, different things that were taken up. So in Chhattisgarh, I saw multiple initiatives. I'll talk of one or two. So Padhai Tu Har Dwar is one that was taken in Chhattisgarh. That means education at your doorstep, essentially. And that basically was education, like teachers, etc., reaching the school, reaching the child directly. So how can education reach the child instead of the child coming to school? Because that was not possible at that point. So again, initiatives to record videos, create an app, train teachers at a massive scale on that app, etc. All of that happened. something very interesting that I liked about the model here, one effort that was taken up was called Bultu Ke Bol, which is basically Bultu is a play on the word Bluetooth. So there are areas where there is no internet connectivity. And so how do you download content, right? How do you upload anything? And so wherever there is internet connectivity, you go download it, and you can use Bluetooth to essentially transfer that material later. And there's one person or one place where there will be material, and you can then transfer it on just using Bluetooth. And that was quite a hit in some of our rural tribal areas where there isn't as much internet connectivity available. I saw Rajasthan state government, I think, had done a really good job in terms of their setting up their education. Again, this online system, having the same route of like training teachers, etc. But everywhere, I think there was some new innovation, something that was tried. Teachers going using like bicycles and vans to go to villages and then teach. So some of those were systemized as well. You know, like there were a fixed set of teachers who were doing that as part of the department. A lot of PD happening, so professional development happening across the board is something that I saw as well. But what are major enabling factors, right? In a state, like there are efforts that different education departments were taking. Some things that I realized that everything is political in a way, right? Not a new realization, but something that just came back.
No, I know. You remember it in a time of crisis, and then it still surprises you sometimes.
Exactly. So, like everything is political, but and so it was sometimes very person dependent. You know, if there was a really passionate, driven individual who wanted to make a difference, it would show, and that would show through in the efforts in the state as well. I've seen people who've done rounds of the entire state during like the peak COVID times to ensure that every district has the resources it needs to be able to continue education in the formats that they are. And then we have states where we've not heard of education become a priority at all, right? And those places, like I think where it's a good and a bad thing in a way, because if it is somebody who's really driven and has the power to make that change, we've seen it happen. But where that will has not existed, or where for the person and the group of people, decision makers, if it's not been a priority, it's not been something that has been taken up as such. And so seen both of those. And I think a second realization was just majorly that partnerships and allies are very crucial. So again, there were state governments and where a lot of NGOs, people, organizations, both, just individuals interested in supporting the state, and also where there was openness to accept those new ideas, to try things out, to get that support, and where people were willing to partner and sort of provide it. There were some of those instances as well. And then there were other areas which were more closed doors, where difficult to get access, not as much of an openness to accept new ideas there. And so saw both of those situations. And I think, so everything is political, and then partnerships and allies are crucial, were like two big takeaways from.
Right. But I think you've raised a sort of important point, because one of the conversations that was definitely happening during the time when we were talking about, okay, should schools reopen, right? Just around that question itself, one of the big questions that came up was, how much should we decentralize this? And this is, of course, a larger policy question we're constantly, an implementation question, right? Where we're constantly asking ourselves. So what you were talking about in terms of, it's very different to talk about getting children to their own school versus the state at scale. And then, all of the examples you sort of spoke about kind of have to balance between those two things, right? Even when you say if there are passionate people, so many things can happen versus when not. So at what point of time, or like at what level do you think that decentralization becomes important, or where do you sort of stand on that question?
I think I'm a firm believer in decentralization. But when we talk of decentralization, then it has to be, if we look at like 73rd, 74th Amendment, Panchayat, the entire decentralization conversation there, then it has to be function and functionary that gets transferred. So more often than not, what I've seen is that the function gets transferred. The fund and the functionary don't. And that then is not a viable model for anybody to work in terms of decentralization, right? So you have to have authority over that with checks and balances in place, obviously. How you are carrying out the actual work and who it is benefiting, etc. So making sure that the intent is clear, the implementation is clear, the checks and balances are in place. But all three of them have to transfer if we're talking of decentralization. And at the same time, I also feel like there are certain decisions that as a union government, we should be having certain measures that can get standardized, or decision making that is done across the board, while taking into consideration at least suggestions or ideas from everybody. Right? So if it is a crisis or a pandemic situation, you need somebody who's in charge. It can be somebody in the union government, it can be a state government, depending on what the issue or the topic is, right? But those things need to be clearly defined. So what happened in this situation with, say, education being on the concurrent list, it was kind of left in the air. You decide some things, but there is a Diksha portal. You should put things online on that. That is a centrally managed portal. Every teacher should log into that also, but there are state governments creating their own versions. Correct. And there is triple amount of work happening. Was it needed? Not. Was there somebody who could have and should have taken a decision? Possibly yes. So I think with decentralization, it leaves certain areas in gray, and that's where the challenge is. So if we can have a more black and white in terms of who's responsible at the end of the day, who is that decision maker for certain areas. So have it be both, but then for certain topics, and particularly in a pandemic, or anything of an emergency of sorts, like who becomes that end decision maker, and how is, like, the key bit of decentralization is also, ownership as well as the voice of that last mile being represented, right? That is very crucial, and which is something that I find missing a lot of times, because nobody is asking that child what they want to do. Nobody is asking them at all. They're not there in any conversation, any debate, nowhere. It is adults making that decision for the child. Okay, fair enough. But are we talking to the parents? Are we talking to the teacher? So if you're looking at the end unit of the education system, are we talking to the teacher and really identifying where their issues and challenges are, and how can we solve for those instead of fitting them into a system? Absolutely. So if we're doing that, then great. Then decentralization is working as it should be, because it is then incorporating, and it's bottom up and top down. But otherwise, this pseudo version of decentralization is a little problematic.
No, absolutely. I think especially that piece of like ownership, right? And having it clearly defined of who will ultimately make the call, so that there should never be the possibility that a call is not made at all. And that is genuinely what we saw happen a lot. That really helps. And I think this point about the fund and the functionary being sort of transferred as well, I think that's a very simple but important point that we often have missed out previously, right? Now that we're talking about out of school children particularly, right? And we've discussed how many of the states did handle it. One thing that we are all very clear on is that even though the pandemic has sort of eased down, and at least we're hoping it will not come back the way it was, we do know the problem out of school children stays. And a lot of the children who did drop out or were absent for prolonged periods of time have not really returned to schools, right? And even in some cases where they have, absenteeism maybe continues to be a big problem, especially with, say, for example, children with disabilities. We, did a study, and we found that within about a month of them trying to attend online classes, so these were obviously children that already had access to internet, to devices and all of that, but because their content wasn't accessible in some way or the other, they very quickly lost interest, right? They were just sitting and staring at a screen and not receiving anything. And the moment they did that and they were absent for 3-4 months, now that they're back to schools, they're still we've missed out so much. It's very difficult for us to actually catch up, right? So given that, what do you think, in your opinion, or maybe based on what you're seeing on ground right now, should be where the state focuses in trying to bring children back to school or addressing this problem in a very real way?
Right. Out of school children, I think, as you rightly pointed out, it was an issue pre-pandemic. It continues to remain an issue post the pandemic. It's the major difference is, I think, the magnitude has increased, and a similarity is that the data doesn't capture that. Right. So even pre-pandemic, when we were looking at the numbers for out of school children, not having data across the board, like publicly available data, is a challenge, I think, in multiple spheres, not just this one. But particularly when we look at like out of school children, there have been multiple efforts under, so previously under the Rajiv Gandhi Shiksha Mission, there were these night shelters that were run.
Yeah.
Post that, there were bridge programs that were run. So state literacy mission authorities,
Yeah.
so RGSM, SLMA, all of these within the education department, and then Samagra Shiksha now as it is, were running bridge programs in different states, right? And with the intent to bring out of school children back into mainstream education, essentially. That was one of the biggest agendas. And the second was that can they at least finish 10th and 12th schooling through open schooling. So either IGNOU or whichever open school access board that is available, can they do that? And I mean, I used to work at a night shelter. I taught at a night shelter in Raipur, and so some of experiences are coming from there, and then some of more what I saw during COVID and what I'm seeing now. But there is no clear mapping of these out of school children.
Yeah.
Right. That remains single-handedly one of the biggest issues that I've seen. Is that there is absolutely no record of how many children, even in a given gram panchayat, are out of school. So I'm not saying at a state level you should actually have data of every single child that's out of school, but even if you want to go as micro as a village, right? The gram pradhan there might be able to tell you, right, a vague number, but is it documented anywhere? Do people really be cognizant of this as a fact published somewhere that, you know, in this particular gram panchayat there are 50 children who are out of school? Right. And what that leads to then is the rest of the cycle of the problem. So during COVID, we saw a lot of migration in and out of cities into villages, back home. People shifted. Children who were studying also were moved out of schools. Schools at certain points where children were then failing, you know, because they couldn't catch up to education. So in the first year, I think nobody particularly would have failed children in terms of, even if they did pass exams and stuff like that, there was considerations there. But in the years that follow, so last year and then this year, children have been facing that sort of an issue as well, right? So I mean, either they drop out because they don't understand, to the point that you were making earlier, like now they're unable to catch up. So that's another reason why they're dropping out in the middle of school years now. Right. And then there's a whole gendered component to it. Absolutely. Right. So once children are out of the schooling system, girls particularly, even more difficult to get them back into the system again, because now they used to be doing the housework, or, you know, the other issues that are associated with girls not being part of the schooling system already, early marriages, etc. So one area which I feel we should tap into, and we've not, as more of a systemic effort, right? Not just I'm talking about one organization doing this or not, but tapping into the community to ensure that this is recorded and then taken up as an important issue. We've not been able to do that, right? So I know if there's a child in my house who's out of school, right? If I want to get the child into school, or if I want to just report that child is out of school right now, I have no way of doing that. I don't feel empowered enough to go and just report that to somebody in the education space, or to an elected representative of my own volition, which is a separate topic and should be worked on. But even here, like, there's no systemic things in place, no measures in place to ensure that people are coming up with that, or how are we collecting that data, right? So it often feels like, and the second aspect of that, the problem is that it feels like it's just a big blot on, say, that state's name, in terms of saying, okay, you know, so bad, look at you, so many children are out of school. And so we don't often get the real picture from the ground. But bridge programs, I think there are, again, teaching at the right level. So if we look at the work, multiple organizations that talk of, you know, some of these things, say Pratham's teaching at the right level work, there's Tap India Foundation that's working on particularly out of school children and their re-entry into schools, multiple organizations that are doing work on out of school children. And their realization is this, that, you know, you should be working with the community for this. Right. So can we involve the religious communities as well, right? So can we have a Pandit and a Maulvi and a Padri speaking about these things? And can they also be encouraging that within their communities? How can this become a more community-driven approach where we want to highlight that, okay, so many of our children are out of school and they should be in school.
Right.
And the government also then creating those systemic measures where one, it can be reported, and second, how do we accommodate? So
Right.
in terms of programs, I think, Nisha, there are so many out there, right?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't comment on like that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel there.
Yeah.
There
Absolutely.
is a lot that's being done. There's a lot of research on this, on how best to get remedial education for children,
Correct.
how to age appropriate learning, grade appropriate learning. And there's a lot being said and done on that. So I think if we were to pick up from multiple programs and sort of just create one that is obviously contextualized to the state and the nature of the demography, I think that would work. So yeah, apart from that, I think just getting in expertise is something that I feel state governments can do on this particular issue. Getting in people who've done work in this space,
Right.
who know what they're doing, making it a political agenda, if I can say that, right? It has to be a political agenda. It has to be something that everybody is talking about.
Right. Right.
And that it is not a matter of shame, but it is something that we need to rectify.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think specifically the piece on sort of making it a community-led mission, right? And something that we're all targeting as a positive thing rather than trying to hide away what the actual numbers are. And I think there is precedence for this in a lot of other movements that we have done that have been sort of ground up, largely, I think, in health and, around vaccination and stuff. A lot of those successes that India has had, exactly, have come from, these kinds of movements. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. And sort of along similar lines, so going ahead, is Indus Action focusing on anything very specific with respect to education and the well-being of children? And what does that look like for, the coming, maybe the major priority when it comes to this area?
Yeah, I think education and well-being of children, mostly points that I have already covered. Like we're trying to look at well-being of the family, and which is impacting the well-being of the child. So indirectly through that. During COVID, we also worked on some mental health efforts for children, helplines that were set up for school children with state governments to kind of call, speak, if they're feeling okay, not, etc. So there were some of those efforts during that time, but those have died down now.
Right.
Education and children, I think our 12-1C work continues to remain a huge part of our portfolio, where we're also trying to look at children who were impacted through COVID, right? So who've lost either the breadwinner of the family or both parents. And, the state also has, nationally, that has been a topic that has come up. All states are mandated to sort of ensure that children get admission under this category and have a specific focus on them. So so that's one piece that we look at. Apart from that, I think looking more critically at different categories of vulnerability. So we've been looking at children with special needs, and how does access to schooling for them look like, right? So like just as starters, and we're focusing a lot more on access right now than what happens beyond that, because just the first step of access in itself is a problem.
Absolutely.
We don't even, out of about 85,000 seats, say under 12-1C in Chhattisgarh, we barely have, I think, 10 children with disability studying, or not even, if I have to check the exact number, but it is really, really low. Like it's 0 point something percentage. Right. And so where do you start to fix that problem? It's a chicken and egg problem. Does the school need to have infrastructure first, and then the child goes there, or should there be demand and then the school will kind of follow? So how are broad RT norms in itself being followed, right? Are there if you're talking only of physical disability, and that too for children who need wheelchairs, access, etc., right? So only for that one narrow subsection are there measures in place. And there are like 18 types of disability. How do you even get started about a school having all of those? So like children with special needs is one, children in need of care and protection. So there are orphans, children that have been given up to the state, etc. How are they being addressed and looked at? Because these are further categories of vulnerability within like a subset of children who might be vulnerable. This is even the most highly prioritized, or PVTGs, for instance. how are we looking at those tribal groups, and where can the system support them,
Right.
but not take over everything that they know about, their lives, even as
Right.
part of social norms, etc. So that's ongoing work, though. I mean, that's things, areas we're looking at, focusing on women, climate change,
Yeah.
certain areas that will have an incidental impact on the child, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, okay. And then I think because we're almost reaching that 1 hour mark as well. So I want to conclude with just like a very quick step back. But so during COVID, as sort of researchers, practitioners, we've been in this space for a little bit of time, and our organizations obviously work in very different ways, but maybe ultimately want to converge on solving similar problems, right? But how do you think we did during the pandemic? Like, where did we sort of drop the ball, or what more could we have done, right? Being invested in this space in such a big way.
Uh, I think as researchers, sometimes the one challenge, if I can be absolutely candid, has been that we're more interested in the research than in the outcome of what that could lead to. So,
Yeah.
say publishing a report is more valuable than actually ensuring that report, who does it reach, who is it
Yeah.
intended for. Uh, the urgency of the outcomes in some places was what I felt could have been slightly different,
Yeah.
right? What could our focus areas have changed at that point,
Mhm.
and been more on, okay, at hand, this is what's needed now. Can
Yeah.
we act first and then look at that? Like, that's one area I felt at a couple of places that did happen. I think a second area where, and this is something that someone from the community, like we were working with a community on ration distribution, and
Mhm.
this lady told me, she was like, oh, you don't want a photo or what? And I was like, photo of what? And she was like, no,
Oh
you're
my
actually
God.
giving us something like for each one of us, or you want us all to just stand here and take a picture with you and for you to put up. And I was just
It's
like, I didn't know what to say to her,
heartbreaking.
because she's not wrong
She's
at
not.
all.
No. Yeah.
So that just hit me in the face that day. And I was like, I mean, while we do take pictures, right,
Yeah.
obviously for our, to document what efforts have happened, to talk about it, etc. But have we made it such a social media game alone that it is more about the picture than the effort?
Yeah.
Was something that hit me. And a third was then just, are we talking about the sort of time exploitation of the communities in terms of data access, research? I mean, data privacy so is out of the window
The
right now.
next
Like, I
one.
don't even
Yeah.
know if I want to touch that topic. But when we're talking of just the amount of time investment that people in communities have done, if you've done research, right, for
Yeah.
instance, can I just take from you?
Mm.
Can I borrow from
Exactly.
your research and just talk about it and build off of that instead of having to do it again and again from scratch? Can we not be,
Absolutely.
we're very territorial and not collaborative, except while talking on, a fancy forum, be like, yes, we should definitely all collaborate. But then when it comes down to the brass tacks, are we that collaborative?
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
we willing to share information? Uh, who is at the end of the day benefiting from this, right? If
Yeah.
it is the community, then they're definitely not benefiting from you and me doing research separately.
Absolutely.
Uh, can there be that collaboration between researchers and practitioners, between
Mm.
academicians and then policymakers? Where is that uh, when it comes to really doing the work? So I think
Right.
those are a few areas, particularly in time of a crisis or a pandemic, that struck out more so
Mm.
than they would in the day-to-day otherwise. But
Yeah.
yeah, these three. But I think I'd also want to highlight one or two points which we did do well on.
Mhm.
I think there were a lot of collaborations and collaboratives that were formed during this time to do some of what I was mentioning in the third point,
Yeah.
like compound their efforts. So during
Mm.
our also like the rapid response, COVID response that we worked on in the first wave, I remember reaching out to people. Like, I reached out to a youth Congress person in Jammu and Kashmir, and a Shiv Sena worker in Maharashtra, and there was an RSS person in Ayodhya who helped us. Like, it was just across the board, apolitical, uh, like extremely it brought out the humaneness, I feel, more so
Yeah.
of people. And that is something that I saw everywhere, be it NGOs, people who were on the ground were well connected and helping each other out. So I feel like it's that layer that was a little removed from the ground is where there were a little more of the challenges that I mentioned were happening.
Right. Absolutely. No, I think that that's extremely important. And I think there was, a lot of organizations have spoken about moving towards sort of more action-oriented approaches, which of course Indus Action has been doing for a very long time. And that's you all call yourself the tank and not the think tank, right? So I mean, I think it was a huge reminder of how important that aspect is. And I think there is also, like you said, a larger sort of incentive system that needs to be reviewed, because I think we've all been in that position as researchers where someone from the community says something like, okay, you keep coming here and taking information from us, why don't you just sit here and teach our kids? Like I've got that before, and they're 100% right. I mean, sure, I can be like, I'm not a teacher, I won't do good, but they're like, what's the counter, right? So yeah, I think these are all extremely important points, and especially that last bit. I think at the end of this series, I'm going to take that and make that a separate snippet, just to like everyone and what they said about how as researchers we need to be doing better. I think that's a whole other conversation that we need to have, even when we're like collaborating and learning from each other. All good? Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Madhuri. It was a pleasure, and I feel like we've learned a lot. And yeah, if there's anything else, we can have a second conversation, I hope. But this has been great. So thank you so much for joining us.
This podcast is produced by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy under the Kotak-Karma Vidhi Inclusive Education Program. The Kotak-Karma Vidhi Inclusive Education Program is a CSR initiative by Kotak Mahindra Bank Ltd. This podcast is based and born from Vidhi's report, Clearing the Air, a synthesized mapping of out-of-school children during COVID-19 in India. This report is produced under funding received from Voltas Limited as part of their CSR initiative. Video design and editing by Asad Ali, illustration by Hitesh Sonar.